The desert remembered nothing. That was the first thing Rafe Cullen had learned about the Mojave, back in another life, before the army decided it no longer needed men who read the ground with their feet. The sand held no score. The rock carried no grudges. The heat simply existed, indifferent and absolute, and it would still be here long after every general had retired to his golf course and every billion-dollar contract had turned to dust. He was counting steps. 1842, 1843. The night pressed against his eyes in every direction, not the soft black of cloud cover or the graduated dark of a forest. This was the blackness of the Mojave at 3 in the morning, a flat wall of nothing that had no distance in it and no depth. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees since sundown, which still felt like standing inside a furnace compared to what he had grown up with in western Pennsylvania. Around him, 19 soldiers moved in a silence that was almost perfect. Almost. There was the soft compression of boot soles on packed sand, the faint creak of load-bearing equipment settling across shoulders that had been carrying weight for too many hours. The barely audible rhythm of controlled breathing from men who had been trained well enough to understand that sound traveled differently in the desert at night, and that their lives, or the simulated version permitted by this exercise, depended on making less of it. These men knew how to be quiet. What they did not know was where they were. That was why they were following a 71-year-old man with a paper map. Rafe Cullen held the topographic sheet at waist level, tilted just enough to catch the faint starlight filtering down between the ridges. The map was a 1:50,000 scale reproduction of a 1967 United States Geological Survey document, printed on waterproof paper that had been folded and refolded so many times the crease lines had become part of the topography itself. Along the left margin, in a careful looping hand that was not his own, were small notations written in pencil. Wind direction by season, soil composition at depth, the thermal behavior of the basalt shelf running 40 feet below the surface grade across this entire Mojave sector. The handwriting belonged to a woman named June Cullen, who had spent 3 days at this very terrain feature in August of 1983, crouching in the heat with her geological instruments and her notebooks, measuring what she called the geometry of hidden ground. June had been a geologist before she became his wife. She had been gone for 4 years, and her notes on this map on this night were the only reason 19 soldiers were still breathing and still moving toward the lights of the forward operating base that none of them could yet see. He counted another step, 1861. He had 14 hours to go before he reached this moment. Here is where it began. It began with the heat. The sun rose over the Mojave on that July morning like something that had decided to make a point. By 6, the temperature at Fort Irwin was already 41 degrees Celsius, and Rafe Cullen had been awake since 4, sitting outside his assigned tent on an overturned ammunition crate, drinking coffee from a battered thermos, and watching the light come over the eastern ridgeline. He had developed the habit of watching ridgelines over the course of his career, the kind of habit that settled into a man after enough years of understanding that ridgelines were where things came from, where threats materialized, where the ground told you what it was about to do. Most of the officers of the 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment of the 25th Infantry Division were still asleep, or they were reviewing digital displays, or they were doing whatever officers did in the modern army when they believed the machines had made the old ways obsolete. Cullen did not hold this against them. A man used the tools available to him. He understood that. He had spent a lifetime using every tool he could find, from the most advanced optics the Army issued to a worn stick pushed into the dirt to measure shadow angles. The tool was not the point. Reading the ground was the point, and the ground did not care what tools you brought. He pulled out the 1967 topographic map and spread it across his knees. He did not look at it immediately. He looked at the terrain first. He looked at the way the morning shadows fell in the low ground between two hills to the northwest, the way that ground disappeared from view when you dropped below a certain elevation, the quality of absence that told an experienced eye the earth had folded in on itself and could hide a great deal of trouble. He looked at 3 locations where the ground did exactly that, where it curved away from line of sight, where even an aerial drone at optimal altitude would register nothing but empty desert floor. The Army had a term for these places: dead ground, terrain that no sensor could see into from above, where men could position themselves and vanish from every screen and every display and every satellite pass overhead. He circled all 3 locations on his map with a pencil. Then he drank his coffee and waited for the day to show him whether he was right. Blaine Dodd arrived at the National Training Center command tent at 7 in the morning, wearing a pressed khaki shirt with the Death Star Systems logo embroidered on the chest pocket. He was 48 years old, with the careful fitness of a man whose gym routine was purchased rather than earned, and he moved through the tent with the ease of someone who understood military hierarchies well enough to navigate them without belonging to one. He set up a presentation system that took 3 minutes to initialize, offered coffee to the officers filtering in, and smiled at everyone who walked past with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent 20 years in defense contracting and knew exactly how much goodwill could be purchased before anyone noticed it was being purchased. Lieutenant Colonel Bo Stroud entered at 7:12. He was 6 feet of compact, precise energy, 43 years old, the kind of officer who wore his rank like a second skin that had grown there naturally and never needed adjustment. He shook Dodd's hand with the grip of a man who wanted to communicate confidence and approval at the same time, and he took his seat at the center of the briefing table with the posture of someone who had not seriously doubted a significant decision in years. Rafe Cullen came in last. He found a chair at the far end of the table and sat down without introducing himself to anyone. Dodd noticed. He made a note of it with a small movement of his pen, a gesture so practiced and minimal that it might have looked like nothing at all to a man who was not paying attention. Then Dodd advanced his presentation and began to speak. Talon 9 was the product of 11 years of development, and according to the slide on the screen, a testing period that had validated its performance across 17 distinct terrain categories including Arctic tundra, tropical jungle, and arid desert. It integrated real-time drone imagery with a continuously updated digital terrain database, enhanced by second-generation MILES training technology, to create what Dodd called a seamless operational picture that removed ambiguity from the training environment. The drone component used machine learning to classify ground features and flag potential threat positions. The digital map database was built on commercial satellite survey data accurate to within 18 months. The MILES integration meant every simulated engagement in the exercise would be tracked, recorded, and scored with a precision that made traditional after-action subjectivity irrelevant. $2.3 billion, a 3-year deployment timeline across the active Army, a decision that would shape how American soldiers trained for the next generation. Stroud asked 3 questions, all technical, all answered with the fluency of a man who had delivered this briefing many times and knew exactly which questions were coming. The other officers leaned forward with the body language of men who had already made up their minds. Cullen waited until Dodd had finished. Then he raised his hand. Stroud looked at him with the expression certain senior officers reserved for civilian consultants who spoke without being invited. Professionally courteous on the surface, privately impatient beneath it. Cullen said. The terrain database. What source material was used for the dead ground classification in this sector? Dodd smiled. Talon 9 integrates commercial satellite-derived elevation data with our proprietary AI terrain processing engine. Validated accuracy within 2 meters across all 17 terrain categories. Commercial satellite data measures surface elevation, Cullen said. What about the 1958 USGS Geological Survey for this range? That document cataloged subsurface basalt formations that alter the visual signature of dead ground from aerial perspective. Surface elevation data would not capture those formations. A pause, very brief. But Cullen had spent 50 years watching pauses, and he knew the difference between a man who was thinking and a man who was deciding what not to say. That survey predates our baseline dataset, Dodd said. The commercial satellite data is significantly more current and more accurate. Different data, Cullen said. Not the same data. More current does not mean more complete. Talon 9 has been validated across 17 terrain categories, Dodd said again. The smile had not moved. Cullen looked at the map folded in his shirt pocket. Then he looked back at the display and said nothing else. Stroud glanced at Dodd. Neither spoke, but something passed between them, the wordless confirmation between two men who had reached an agreement before the meeting began. After the briefing, Cullen found SFC Giles trot outside the tent, running a systems check on his radio equipment with the focused patience of a man who trusted nothing he had not personally verified. Trot was 38, a broad-shouldered operations sergeant with a close-cropped beard going gray at the temples, and a quality of attentiveness in his eyes that separated soldiers who had learned from experience from those who had only learned from training. He had been the one who met Cullen at the main gate the previous afternoon, driven him to his assigned tent, and over dinner in the DFAC asked 3 precise questions about terrain navigation methodology. 3 questions that told Cullen he was in the presence of a man who genuinely wanted to understand something. Cullen handed him the topographic map. He had added his 3 pencil circles where June's handwriting stopped. OPFOR will position here, here, and here, he said. All 3 are dead ground from any aerial angle. The first position, northwest of phase line Bravo, is their primary. The second is a flanking element. The third is a reserve they will use if Stroud attempts a southward adjustment. They will hit the lead element between checkpoint 4 and checkpoint 5. Trot looked at the circles, then at the Talon 9 terrain display on his tablet, then back at the circles. The expressions moved across his face in sequence: skepticism, recalculation, something approaching belief but not quite there yet. These positions are not flagged in the system, Trot said. No, Cullen said, they would not be. What do you want me to do with this? Nothing, Cullen said. I only wanted someone to know I said it before it happened. He walked back to his tent in the growing heat and sat down on the cot and opened the topographic map again. The morning light came through the canvas and fell across the left margin and across June's handwriting, and he read her notes the way he always read them now. Not for the information, because he knew every word she had written there. He read them for the sound of her voice inside the words. She had described the Mojave as a museum of patience. She had said that the desert kept its secrets in the shape of what it hid, that if you wanted to understand what was beneath the surface you had to look at what was above it, at the places where the ground folded away from sight, at the absences. She had been talking about geology. Cullen had applied it to war for 4 decades, and the application had held. He sat with the map until he heard the first units begin to move. The exercise commenced at 9 in the morning under a sky bleached to the color of old bone. Stroud's battalion moved in 3 coordinated elements toward their assigned objectives, guided by the Talon 9 overlay and real-time feeds from 4 autonomous drones working the airspace in overlapping sectors. The picture on the command displays was genuinely impressive. Cullen had to give it that. Standing at the edge of the observation area with binoculars older than most of the privates in the formation, he could see the information advantage the system provided. Every vehicle position plotted and updated. Every checkpoint logged the instant lead elements crossed it. MILES gear on every soldier transmitting contact data in real time. It was precise. It was fast. It represented a genuine technological achievement. He watched the lead element approach checkpoint 4. He lowered his binoculars and looked at the ground instead. He looked at the northwest ridgeline and the way the morning shadow fell into the fold below it. He looked at the way the terrain dropped away from what appeared to be the high point and then curved back in a crease invisible from above 45 degrees of elevation. He looked at the way the wind, which had shifted 7 minutes ago, was now drawing out of that crease, which meant the crease was releasing heat, which meant something down there had been absorbing heat since before the sun came over the ridge. He raised his binoculars again. The lead element passed checkpoint 4. They moved with the calm confidence of soldiers who believed their screens were telling them everything. The drone overhead showed open desert floor. Talon 9 showed flat, unoccupied, unremarkable terrain. Nothing flagged, nothing at all. And then the MILES gear on the first 6 soldiers began to shriek. The electronic tone of a MILES casualty event was a sound every soldier in the United States Army learned to hate, because it meant that in a real scenario, you were no longer a combatant, but a problem for the people still alive to solve. 6 tones became 9 as the OPFOR element, lying flat in the dead ground fold, since before sunrise opened its simulated fire on the exposed left flank. 9 became 14 as the flanking OPFOR element, positioned exactly where Cullen had drawn his second circle, began working the right side of the formation. The soldiers reacted with discipline. They dropped, called for suppression, used what terrain they had. But the terrain they had was flat and exposed, and the terrain the OPFOR had was invisible, and by the time the formation adapted, 22 soldiers had been tagged as simulated casualties in the first 9 minutes. In a real engagement, with real ammunition, this would have been the end. Stroud's voice came over the radio net, sharp and controlled, calling for smoke and reorganization. His training was evident. His reaction time was good, but the math of the contact was what it was. Cullen lowered his binoculars. He stood without moving for a moment. He was not triumphant. He had never felt triumphant when he turned out to be right about something that put soldiers in the dirt, even in a training context where no one was actually hurt. He felt something older and quieter, the weight of knowledge that has no good destination. Trot appeared beside him without announcement. The sergeant looked at the terrain. He looked at the display on his tablet, still showing empty desert in the northwest sector. He said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said, "You marked 3 locations." "Yes," Cullen said. "They hit 2 of them. The third element is holding in reserve. They will use that position if Stroud makes a southward adjustment in the second phase." Cullen paused. "He will make a southward adjustment. The Talon 9 overlay shows that route as the path of least resistance. He will follow what the system shows him." Trot was quiet, the quiet of a man processing something that required recalibrating an assumption he had held for a long time. "How did you know where they would be?" Cullen looked at the northwest fold in the ground, at the quality of shadow still pooled in its depths even as the sun climbed. "The ground told me," he said. "You have to know how to ask." Stroud arrived at the observation point 14 minutes later. He had the controlled expression of a commander who had taken a significant and public hit and was already organizing his internal response. He reviewed the Talon 9 display on Dodd's tablet. He looked at the terrain. He did not look at Cullen. Dodd stood at his shoulder with the clipboard. OPFOR made an exceptional position selection, Dodd said, his voice carrying the calm of a prepared statement. Drone coverage was at optimal parameters. This represents a low probability deviation from the modeled threat distribution. The system performed precisely as designed. The system did not flag those positions, Trott said. His voice was level and factual. The positions fell outside the modeled threat parameters, Dodd said. Cullen waited. He had been waiting for a very long time for precisely this kind of moment, and he had learned over the years that patience was the only instrument that worked in rooms like this one. He was 71 years old. He had proven everything there was to prove a long time ago, and the Army had taken that proof away from him in 1998, and he had spent the years since telling himself he no longer needed to prove it again. Standing here now, with 22 simulated casualties in the sand and 3 pencil circles confirmed on a paper map nobody had asked to see, he was not entirely certain that was still true. Stroud finally looked at him. "Mr. Cullen, do you have a comment?" "No, sir," Cullen said. It was not the answer Stroud had expected. The lieutenant colonel studied him for a moment with the eyes of a man recalibrating something he had already categorized and filed. Then Stroud turned back to his radio net. Dodd wrote something on his clipboard. Cullen did not attempt to read it. He did not need to. He walked back to his tent alone through the climbing heat of mid-morning. 90 minutes later, during the administrative rest period between exercise phases, SFC Trott came into his tent without knocking. He sat on the second ammunition crate without being invited. He had a tablet, and he was not looking at the screen. He was looking at Cullen with the careful expression of a man who had found something he was not certain how to deliver. "I pulled your consulting contract," Trott said. "The full document." Cullen waited. Trott set the tablet on the cot between them and turned it. "Section 7, Clause C, read it." Cullen leaned forward and read it. Consultant is prohibited from engaging in or providing field navigation instruction, terrain analysis guidance, route selection advisory services, or any form of tactical orientation counsel to active duty personnel during live or simulated training scenarios. He read the clause twice. The language was deliberate in the way that legal language became deliberate when a careful person had spent time making it precise for a particular purpose. He had seen language almost exactly like this before. He had seen it in a document dated November of 1998, in the findings summary of an Army investigation into a training incident at Fort Polk, Louisiana, that had resulted in the death of one soldier and the permanent disability of a second. In that document, the finding had used nearly identical phrasing to classify his teaching methodology as non-standard and potentially hazardous. He had been given a choice then: retire quietly and allow the investigation's conclusion to stand, or fight the finding and drag a general's son through a proceeding that would end the careers of 3 enlisted soldiers who would have no choice but to testify. He had retired. He had kept quiet. He had spent 23 years telling himself it had been the right decision. He looked at the header of the consulting agreement. He looked at the date. He looked at the signature block. Blaine Dodd had countersigned the contract on behalf of Death Star Systems as the coordinating civilian authority for Cullen's participation in this exercise. Blaine Dodd had written Clause 7C. Cullen set the tablet down on the cot. He sat very still the way he had learned to sit still when something very large was becoming clear, when the hidden ground was finally revealing itself from the inside. He requested you by name, Trot said, keeping his voice low and even. I went back to the original G3 routing. The request for a terrain navigation consultant originated with Death Star, not with the division. They specified you by name. They described you as the foremost remaining practitioner of pre-digital terrain analysis methodology. They said your presence would add historical and doctrinal value to the validation exercise. He paused. Those were their exact words. Historical value. The canvas wall of the tent moved in a pulse of hot air. Somewhere to the north, beyond the ridgeline, a helicopter was making its approach to the main pad, its rotors flat and far away in the dry air. Cullen said, "What else did you find?" Trot's jaw moved once before he spoke. "There is a name in the 1998 Fort Polk investigation summary. The junior officer who altered the approved route without authorization, whose unilateral decision to bypass your marked dead ground feature caused the incident." He let the pause sit for exactly the right length of time. "His name is Peter Dodd." The heat pressed against the tent walls. Cullen looked at the topographic map on his knee, at the 3 pencil circles, at June's notation in the left margin, the angle of the basalt shelf, the bearing of the subsurface formation, the shape of what is hidden. He had been brought here to fail. Not to consult, not to contribute, not to add historical value to a validation exercise. He had been brought here because Blaine Dodd needed him to fail in front of the brass, in front of the cameras mounted on the Talon 9 observation rigs, in front of the general officers and G3 staff who would be watching when the old man with the paper map made his inevitable mistake. He had been brought here so that Dodd could stand in front of the Army's procurement authority and say, with documentation and a camera record, that the pre-digital methodology had been tested and found wanting, that Rafe Cullen had been given every opportunity, that the approach had failed, that the $2.3 billion contract should proceed without reservation. The 1998 finding had been the beginning of this story. Today was supposed to be the end. Cullen looked at Trot. Trot looked back. There was a quality of silence between men who had served in difficult places that contained everything. They were both thinking without requiring either of them to put any of it into words. "What are you going to do?" Trot asked. Cullen folded the topographic map along June's last marked crease. He put it in his shirt pocket. He rose from the cot, and for a moment the accumulated weight of the heat and the years and the exhaustion of a man who had been right about the same thing for too long pressed down on him from every direction. He was 71 years old. His left knee had been rebuilt after an injury during a mountain exercise in 1991. The scar on his right forearm from a rappelling accident in 1979 ached in the heat, the way old injuries did when they chose to remember themselves. He was old in the way that men who had used their bodies in hard places became old, not broken, but carrying the full record of everything they had ever asked of themselves. He picked up his binoculars. He said, "The same thing I have always done." He walked back out into the heat. The second exercise phase resumed at 2 in the afternoon. Stroud had adapted after the morning contact. His elements moved with more spacing, more distance between units, reduced exposure at each bound. It was the correct adaptation, made by a man who processed tactical feedback quickly and without ego. Cullen watched from the observation point and kept his opinions to himself. He had a contract with Clause 7C in it. He had Blaine Dodd standing 40 feet away with his clipboard and his Death Star polo shirt, and the afternoon was not finished yet. Dodd came to stand beside him at 2:35. "Remarkable terrain," Dodd said. He looked at the desert with the expression of a man who found neither the terrain nor the conversation particularly interesting, who was simply occupying space and filling the silence, because silence between two men who are aware of each other serves no one's agenda. Cullen said nothing. "The Army has come a long way," Dodd said. "Since the old days, the paper maps and the compass work. It matters the history of it, but the institution has to move forward. The soldiers of today need the tools of today. That is not a criticism of anyone. That is simply how progress works." Cullen kept his binoculars on the terrain to the northwest. "No disrespect to the traditions," Dodd said. "None at all." Cullen lowered his binoculars. He looked at Blaine Dodd directly for the first time. He looked at the man's face, the careful pleasantness of it, the managed expression that long practice in rooms where money changed hands had polished to a surface without seams. He looked at the clipboard. He looked at the Death Star logo on the chest pocket. He said, "Your brother serves on the Death Star board." Not a question. A statement made in the same flat, factual tone that Cullen used for everything. Dodd did not move. Not a muscle in his face, not a shift in his weight, not a change in his breathing that Cullen could detect. It was the stillness of a man who had prepared for this specific moment and was executing his preparation exactly. "Peter is on the advisory board," Dodd said. "That is public record." "Is that right?" Cullen said. He raised his binoculars again. At 4:12 in the afternoon, the radio on Trott's hip began transmitting and receiving at an elevated rate. Cullen noticed first because he had been watching Trott rather than the terrain in the interval between the second exercise phase and the administrative pause before the day's debrief. He noticed because Trott's face, normally the steady and unrevealing face of a man who processed information without demonstrating it, had shifted into something tighter. Something with a texture Cullen recognized from years of watching men receive news they did not want to be receiving. Trott crossed the distance between them in 12 steps. "Sergeant Drew Patch," Trott said, keeping his voice at the edge of what was audible to them alone. 24 years old, 3rd Platoon, B Company. He led a 4-man reconnaissance element into the northeast sector at 15:30. The other 3 members of the element got turned around when the terrain split the formation at the northeast ridge and made it back to the phase line boundary. Patch went deeper into the sector alone. Trott stopped. He looked at Cullen directly. "Last radio contact at 15:41. Nothing since." Cullen looked at the northeast sector on his mental map. The northeast sector, the 3rd circle, the position he had described to Trott that morning as the OPFOR reserve, the position Talon 9 showed as flat, unoccupied, unremarkable desert. "How long?" Cullen asked. 31 minutes of no contact. Temperature in that sector, 47 degrees, and holding with the thermal inversion from the East Canyon. Cullen turned to face the northeast ridgeline. He looked at the way the ground fell away from the apparent high point. He looked at the quality of shadow gathering in the fold below it, even as the late afternoon sun still hammered the open terrain. He thought about a 24-year-old soldier in 47-degree heat with no radio contact, and no one in the command tent who knew where he actually was, because the system they were trusting did not have the data to show them what was in that fold. Trott said quietly, "He is Lieutenant Colonel Stroud's sponsored cadet. Stroud wrote his ROTC recommendation letter. Stroud personally requested him for the battalion when Patch commissioned." Cullen absorbed this without comment. He was already working through the 3rd circle on the topo in his mind, through June's notation alongside it, through the words she had written in pencil 23 years before he would need them, about the basalt shelf in that sector, and the way the dead ground there would hold heat in its floor long after the sun moved off the ridgeline, the way a man sitting in it without shade and without water after 30 minutes would be past the point of voluntary recovery. 47 degrees and climbing. A 24-year-old soldier. 31 minutes. Stroud came out of the command tent at a controlled walk that his training kept from becoming a run. He reached trot first, received the report in clipped sentences, then looked at the Talon 9 display. The system showed empty desert in the northeast sector. No threat flags, no terrain warnings, no indication of anything in that fold at all. Then Stroud looked at Cullen. He looked at the old man with the battered binoculars and the worn shirt and the paper map folded in his breast pocket, and something moved behind Stroud's eyes that had not been there during the morning briefing or any of the hours since Cullen had arrived at this installation. Stroud was a man who had built his career on correct assessments and decisive action, and the assessment he was making right now, in this moment, was one he had not prepared himself to make. The radio on Trot's hip stayed silent. The desert offered nothing. The Talon 9 display showed its clean, confident picture of terrain it did not actually understand. And Lieutenant Colonel Bo Stroud looked at the 71-year-old civilian consultant at the edge of the observation area. And for the first time since Rafe Cullen had arrived at Fort Irwin, California, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division had nothing at all to say. The third circle was out there, in 47 degrees of heat that was still climbing. And somewhere inside it, a 24-year-old soldier was waiting for someone to know where he was. Stroud had not yet spoken. That was the thing Cullen noticed first. Stroud stood at the edge of the observation area with the radio in his hand, and the Talon 9 display screen showing him a clean picture of empty desert in the northeast sector. No flags, no threats, no indication of anything alive in that fold. The system was working exactly as designed. The system was also wrong about everything that mattered. He looked at Cullen. Cullen was already looking at the northeast ridgeline. He had the binoculars up and was studying the way the late afternoon light shifted the shadows at the base of the fold, the way the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor bent differently in that pocket of terrain, thickening and distorting in a way that meant the ground there was radiating stored heat rather than simply reflecting ambient temperature. A basalt shelf 40 feet down could hold heat for 6 hours after the surface above it began to cool. Cullen knew this because June had written it in the margin of the topographic map in 1983, and he had read those words several hundred times since then. He lowered the binoculars. He went in through the east approach, Cullen said, statement not question. Trot said, that is the route the Talon 9 overlay showed as the optimal reconnaissance path. Then he is in the fold, 30 meters in, maybe 40. Cullen looked at Stroud. The temperature in the bottom of that fold right now is between 50 and 53 degrees. He has been in there for 36 minutes. Stroud's jaw set. I am aware of the temperature. Then you know we have approximately 20 minutes before this becomes a medical situation instead of a navigation problem. Blaine Dodd appeared at Stroud's shoulder like a man who had been waiting for precisely this configuration of people and problems. He had his clipboard. He had his Death Star polo shirt and his managed calm and the expression of a man performing concern in front of an audience. Lieutenant Colonel, Dodd said, the drone network can increase coverage in that sector. We can have thermal imaging overhead in 4 minutes. Thermal imaging will not see into the fold, Cullen said. The basalt shelf reflects the drone's own thermal signature. It is a documented limitation of airborne infrared in this terrain type. The 1958 survey noted it. Mr. Cullen, Dodd said, his voice careful and smooth. The system has validated procedures for exactly this kind of search and recovery situation. Cullen was not looking at Dodd, he was looking at Stroud. "I will go in," he said. Flat and factual, the way Cullen said everything. The way a man spoke when he had stopped needing anyone to be impressed by what he was saying. Stroud opened his mouth to respond. Dodd moved first. He pulled a document from the back of his clipboard, a single sheet folded in thirds, and set it on the nearest flat surface with the deliberate care of a man placing evidence. "Lieutenant Colonel Stroud," Dodd said, "I need to bring something to your attention before any action is taken." He tapped the document with 2 fingers. Section 7, Clause C of Mr. Cullen's consulting agreement, signed on his arrival, prohibits him from engaging in field navigation instruction, terrain analysis guidance, or route advisory services during active training scenarios. If he enters that sector in a navigation capacity, Death Star's liability coverage for this exercise is voided. The Army assumes full exposure. Silence. A drone passed somewhere to the south, its rotors a thin mechanical whisper against the weight of the desert afternoon. Stroud looked at the document. He looked at Dodd. He looked at Cullen. The expression on his face was that of a man standing at an intersection he had not anticipated reaching. Cullen picked up the document. He read Clause 7C. He read it fully. Every word of the deliberate language that Blaine Dodd had written to match the phrasing of the 1998 Army investigation finding that had been used to end his career. He read it the way you read something when you want to confirm it is exactly what you already know it is. Then he folded the document in half. He folded it again. He tore it into 4 pieces with the unhurried precision of a man who had made a decision some time ago and was only now completing the physical act of it. He set the 4 pieces on the surface where the document had been. He looked at Dodd for exactly 2 seconds. He said nothing. He did not need to say anything. 71 years of being right about things that mattered had given him an authority that needed no words to carry it. He picked up his binoculars. He picked up the topographic map. He walked toward the northeast ridgeline. Nobody stopped him. Trot fell in beside him at the boundary of the observation area, his radio on his hip and his stride matching Cullen's without being asked to. Behind them, Dodd was speaking to Stroud in a low and urgent tone. Cullen did not look back. The terrain ahead required everything he had, and everything he had was what it was going to get. They reached the mouth of the dead ground fold together. The heat hit them both like a wall, the concentrated heat of enclosed terrain where the sun had been driving thermal energy into a basalt shelf for 9 hours, releasing it upward into a space with no air movement and no shade. The heat of a room sealed all day in direct sunlight, and then opened for the first time. It pressed against the face and chest with a physical weight that made the first breath feel like the wrong choice. Cullen stopped at the fold entrance. He unfolded the topographic map and held it between them, red lens flashlight on the margin notations. He traced the route he intended to walk with 1 finger. He showed Trot the 3 XG depressions marked by June in 1983. He showed him the bearing line he would hold inside, running at 22 degrees from magnetic north, following the thick part of the basalt shelf where the UXO, if it had sunk to depth in the decades since placement, would be furthest below boots. "I need you here," Cullen said. "Right here at the mouth. Radio coverage from inside this fold is unreliable. Patch's unit radio failed the moment he went in. You manage the net from this position, keep Stroud informed, and run a search." He paused. "Army Historical Training Incident Database. 1998, Fort Polk. Look at the full secondary section, not just the findings summary." Trot looked at him. "You know what I am going to find." "I know what you need to find," Cullen said. "There is a difference." He took the map back. He folded it. He put it in his breast pocket. He breathed through his nose, 3 measured breaths. He had been in worse. He could not remember exactly when, but he had been in worse. He took one step into the fold, and the smell hit him. Not the smell of desert rock or dry sand. Something beneath those things, something from the ground itself, a mineral quality in the air that came from basalt formations releasing stored thermal energy, the smell of rock that had been cooking for 9 hours. It was a smell he had not encountered in 26 years. He had last smelled it on a November morning in Louisiana in 1998. Fort Polk, the Joint Readiness Training Center, a chalk briefing the night before, fluorescent lights and folding chairs and 23 soldiers in the audience. He had stood at the board and written danger in capital letters, and beneath it dead ground, and he had explained, for the third time in 2 days, why the direct approach was dangerous, and the long route around the ridge was the safe one. The words had gone into the air and the soldiers had nodded, most of them, and written in their notebooks. But there had been one face in the back row that was not nodding, a young lieutenant with the posture of a man already calculating what he could skip without consequence. He had looked at his watch twice during the briefing. He had asked no questions. He had signed the route plan acknowledgement form with the efficiency of a man completing a formality. The next morning, the lieutenant had taken the direct approach. Cullen closed his eyes. The chalkboard, the room, the faces, then darkness, radio traffic going from routine to urgent in a single transmission, his own voice on the net asking for the position, and then the response that told him the position was 40 feet inside the dead ground feature he had marked as dangerous, and one soldier was not responding, and a second soldier was not responding, and the unit was requesting medical immediately. He had run the 300 meters from the observation post. He remembered the quality of the ground under his boots, and the way the dead ground folded around him as he entered it, and the way the heat of that November Louisiana morning was nothing like this heat, and yet the smell was the same, and the shape of the ground was the same, and the silence was the same. He had found them. One was conscious, one was not. One never was again. Cullen opened his eyes. 3 seconds had passed. The smell of the basalt was still in his nose, and the fold of the dead ground was around him and ahead of him. "Not this time," he said, quiet. To himself or to June or to the ground, it did not matter. He took the next step. He moved into the fold the way he had always moved in difficult terrain, slowly and with attention, reading the ground beneath his boots rather than watching the horizon. The sole of a boot on desert terrain was an instrument most soldiers did not know they were carrying. The density of the substrate changed with depth. The compaction of the surface layer told you about the basalt underneath. The resistance beneath the heel versus the toe told you about slope gradient when the eye could not see it. This was not mysticism. This was mechanics. It was the difference between looking at the surface of water and understanding that water had depth. He moved alone now. The silence inside the fold was different from the silence outside it, more complete, more purposeful. The kind of silence that comes from a place where the world's ordinary sounds, wind and aircraft and engines and voices, simply cannot reach. He read 40 meters of ground in 11 minutes. At the fold entrance behind him, Trot was on his radio. His voice was low and clipped, feeding position updates to Stroud's command post, relaying what Cullen had described before going in. He had his tablet out. He was running the Army Historical Training Incident Database search. The fold mouth gave him enough clearance from the basalt interference zone to hold his signal. Not perfect, but sufficient. It was exactly where Cullen had told him to be. Inside the fold, Cullen stopped. He looked down at the ground in front of him. Then he looked at the topographic map. He found the notation in the left margin in June's careful hand at the bottom of the third circle, below where he had written the word reserve in block letters that morning. June's notation read, XG formation present, approx 15 m diameter, below grade, survey depth 1958. He looked back at the ground. There was a slight depression in the desert surface, barely visible, the kind of thing you would cross without noticing if you were watching a screen instead of the earth. But the surface had a different quality at that depression, a subtle crumbling at the edges, a compaction at the center inconsistent with the surrounding substrate. And there were other things that had no business being in a training range in active use since the 1970s. Partially exposed metal, corroded, old. Very old. Cullen went to one knee and looked at the metal fragment without touching it. He looked at the depression. He looked at the area around it and the two smaller depressions now visible from this angle. He pulled out the topographic map and unfolded it to the notation. XG. He had seen that notation before, in a different survey from a different theater. It was a marking used by the USGS in the 1950s and early 1960s for sites identified as containing unexploded ordnance from earlier military use. X for explosive risk, G for ground level or below. The notation system had been standardized in 1956 and discontinued in 1963 when a new federal marking protocol replaced it. Any database built after 1963 from sources other than the original survey documents would not carry the notation, would not know it existed. This area had been a training range during the Second World War. The weapons tested here in the early 1940s had not all detonated. Some were still here, 40 feet underground or 3 feet underground or 8 inches underground, depending on where you were standing. And 15 meters inside this field, partially visible behind a low rock shelf that the fold created when the terrain curved back on itself, was Sergeant Drew Patch. He was sitting upright against the rock, which was the right instinct and told Cullen the soldier had kept his head. His helmet was off, and his water supply was empty, understandable in 50-degree heat after 38 minutes of immobility. His face was the red of a man who had been in early stages of heat exhaustion for approximately the last 15 minutes. His eyes were open and tracked when Cullen appeared at the edge of the rock shelf. Cullen said, "Do not get up." Patch went still. "There are 3 ordnance sites between you and the entrance to this fold. You cannot see them from where you are sitting, and your MILES gear cannot detect them. I am going to bring you water, and then I am going to tell you exactly how to walk out of here." Patch said, "Sir, I need to tell you something." His voice was dry and careful, a man monitoring his own coherence. "My radio failed when I came in here. I have been trying to signal with my mirror, but the angle was wrong." "I know," Cullen said. "I heard the OPFOR unit set up 40 meters to my east, 3 of them. They were in position before I came into the fold. They are still there." Cullen looked east. The third circle, the reserve element, right where he had drawn it at 6 in the morning on an overturned ammunition crate with a cup of coffee. He did not say anything about that. He crossed the 12 meters to Patch's position in a path that avoided the 3 depressions, each foot placement deliberate. He gave Patch the water from his own supply. He watched the soldier drink with the controlled discipline of someone who understood that drinking too fast would make things worse. Then he unfolded the topographic map and spread it on the rock shelf between them. He showed Patch the 3 XG markings. He traced the path out with one finger. "That is where you are going to put your feet, nowhere else." He paused. "Can you walk?" "Yes, sir." "Then we walk." While Cullen was inside the fold, Trot was working the fold boundary with the precision of a man who understood that situations like this one required information to move at exactly the right speed. He was on the radio net, feeding Stroud's command post a continuous stream of updates. He was simultaneously running the Army Historical Training Incident Database search on his tablet, the signal from the fold mouth just strong enough to hold the connection. The database search took 4 minutes. The result took considerably longer to process. The 1998 Fort Polk Training Incident. Investigation Reference Number. Findings Summary. Primary contributing factor. Non-standard terrain navigation instruction by civilian contracted advisor Rafe Cullen, whose methodology was classified as outside approved doctrinal parameters. Recommended action. Termination of consulting relationship and removal of supplemental doctrine from training curricula. He had read all of that before, when Cullen showed him the contract clause. What he had not looked at carefully was the secondary section. The section that documented the corrective action taken against the junior officer, whose unauthorized route deviation had been the proximate cause of the incident. Junior officer involved, First Lieutenant Peter Allen Dodd. Corrective action taken, letter of reprimand filed and sealed, no further adverse action. Authorizing signature on the sealed reprimand, Brigadier General Myron Harless. Trot read that name twice. Brigadier General Myron Harless, who was currently commanding general of the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, who was at this moment in the main command tent reviewing the day's exercise results, who had approved Rafe Cullen's participation in this validation exercise after Blaine Dodd's consulting request came through the G3 channel. Trot sent the document image to Stroud's tablet with a message that said only, "Read this, all of it." Then he looked back into the fold entrance and maintained his position, because whatever was about to happen in the command tent was going to happen whether he watched it or not, and his job right now was here, at this boundary, holding the signal for the man moving through the dark ground 40 meters ahead of him. Stroud read the document. He read it standing in the command tent with Dodd 4 feet away, still pressing his case about liability exposure and proper procedure, still working the clipboard with the energy of a man who understood that momentum was everything. Stroud was not listening. He was reading about Peter Dodd. He was reading about Myron Harless. He was reading about a letter of reprimand that had been sealed instead of filed, filed meaning it would follow a career, sealed meaning it would not. He was reading the corrective action section that described the route deviation as a momentary lapse of judgment by an otherwise promising young officer rather than as what it actually was, which was a direct and documented violation of an explicit safety warning that had been given in writing and signed for. He set the tablet down. He looked at Blaine Dodd. Something shifted in Stroud's face that had not shifted there in a long time, not the hot and immediate anger of a man who had been insulted or embarrassed. Something colder and more deliberate. The anger that arrived when a man understood he had been played, that the confidence he had felt in his own judgment had been exploited by someone who knew exactly what that confidence looked like and how to aim a man's certainty in a direction that served someone else's purpose. He said, "Where is your brother now, Mr. Dodd?" Dodd looked at him. The clipboard came down 1 inch. "Excuse me." "Peter Dodd, your brother, where is he now?" A beat of silence, shorter than the ones before it. "Peter is in the private sector," Dodd said. "He left the Army in 2003. And he is on the advisory board at Death Star Systems." "That is public record." "Was it public record," Stroud said, "when you submitted the consulting request that brought Rafe Cullen to this installation?" The tent went quiet. Outside, a vehicle engine ran somewhere to the west. A radio net chattered in the far corner. Neither of these things mattered. Dodd set the clipboard on the table slowly. "Lieutenant Colonel," he said, "I think this conversation would benefit from having legal counsel present." "I think you are right," said a voice from the tent entrance. Colonel Ruth Camp stepped through the canvas opening and stood in the late afternoon light that came through with her. She was 56 years old, gray at the temples, with the posture of a military officer who had been in enough rooms like this one to have stopped needing to announce herself in them. She wore standard Army service uniform, not the G3 observer credentials that had been on her identification badge when she arrived at Fort Irwin the previous evening. A different badge now. Different letters beneath her name. Jag. She set a folder on the briefing table between Stroud and Dodd. The folder had a federal seal on the front and a reference number, and the words "Investigation Active" stamped in red. "Mr. Dodd," Camp said, "my name is Colonel Ruth Camp. I am a criminal investigative attorney with the Judge Advocate General's Corps, currently attached to the Army Inspector General's office. I have been conducting a fraud investigation into the contract acquisition practices of Death Star Systems for the past 14 months. She opened the folder. "I have federal warrants for the seizure of records related to Talon 9 contract negotiations, including the deliberate exclusion of the 1958 USGS dead ground survey data from the Talon 9 terrain database." She looked at him steadily. "The exclusion of that data was not an oversight, Mr. Dodd. It was a cost decision. Incorporating the survey data would have required the Army to fund remediation of 17 unexploded ordnance sites across 4 training installations at a cost that would have delayed the contract award by approximately 2 years. Your company made the calculation that the risk was acceptable." Dodd did not move. "The warrant also names Brigadier General Myron Harless," Camp said, "in connection with the alteration of the 1998 Fort Polk investigation finding and the suppression of the commanding officer's original recommendation, which was a general court-martial for First Lieutenant Peter Dodd." Stroud was very still. "I have been aware of this installation situation since this morning," Camp continued. "I have been waiting. Specifically, I have been waiting for Mr. Cullen to demonstrate that his methodology works. Because the single remaining argument that Death Star's legal team can make, the argument that protects the contract and the people connected to it, is that Rafe Cullen's approach to terrain navigation is genuinely dangerous. That the 1998 finding was accurate on the merits." She looked at Stroud. "If Cullen succeeds tonight, that argument fails. The contract falls, and General Harless does not retire with his reputation intact." Stroud looked at the folder. He looked at the warrant. He looked at the name on the warrant that was the name of the general he reported to, the general who had approved his command assignment, the general who was 400 meters away in the main command tent, and who was going to be informed within the next 12 minutes that his name was on a federal document. His radio crackled. The transmission came from Harless's command net, relayed through the BN operations frequency. The voice was the general's aide, which meant the message was being delivered at a remove, which meant Harless already knew something was happening and had decided to apply pressure from a distance before deciding how close to get. The message said that it had been reported to the commanding general that civilian consultant Rafe Cullen was currently operating outside the parameters of his contracted role within an active training area. The message said that the commanding general was directing Lieutenant Colonel Stroud to immediately order the cessation of all unauthorized civilian activity in the Northeast sector. The message said that failure to comply would be considered a violation of standing operating procedures and would be addressed accordingly. The radio went quiet. Stroud looked at Camp. Camp looked back at him with the expression of a woman who understood exactly what he was holding and was not going to tell him what to do with it. He looked at Dodd, standing with his clipboard and his pale face, and the stillness of a man who had run out of moves, and was waiting to see what the board looked like before deciding whether to tip his king. He looked at the northeast ridgeline through the open tent flap. Somewhere in the fold beyond that ridgeline, a 71-year-old man was walking a 24-year-old soldier through an unmarked ordnance field in 50-degree heat, using the pencil notations of a woman who had been dead for 4 years. Because the $2.3 billion system that was supposed to make all of that unnecessary had been built on a dataset with a deliberate hole in it. Stroud keyed his radio. He opened his mouth. He thought about what he was about to say and what it would mean, and who would hear it, and what the record would show. And he thought about Drew Patch at 24 years old in that fold with no water left. And he thought about the document on his tablet, and the name at the bottom of the sealed reprimand, and the 23 years that Rafe Cullen had spent in silence, rather than drag soldiers into a proceeding that would have ended their careers to save his own. He closed his hand around the radio. The tent was absolutely quiet. Camp was watching him. Dodd was watching him. The drone passed overhead in the far distance, its cameras sending their clean and confident picture of empty desert to a display screen that showed nothing but flat terrain in the northeast sector. Stroud held the radio. He did not transmit. The next move was his, and the wrong one would seal everything. And somewhere out in the dead ground, a man who had been right about the same thing for 23 years was counting steps through the dark and trusting that someone in this tent was going to make the right call. Stroud set the radio on the table. Not down, not away. He set it deliberately in the center, where it could still be reached by anyone who wanted to pick it up. He set it the way a man set something down when he was done with it for now, and wanted everyone present to understand that the decision had been made, and it was not reversible, and it was his. He looked at Camp. She held his gaze for 2 seconds and then looked away, which was the answer he needed. He looked at Dodd. Dodd's face had settled into the face of a man who had run a very long and very careful game, and was watching the last move go in a direction he had not accounted for. The clipboard was on the table. His hand was not on it. Stroud said, "Colonel Camp, is there anything in your current investigation that prevents a commanding officer from entering an active training area to assist in a casualty recovery?" Camp said no. "Then I am going to the northeast sector." He looked at Dodd one more time. It was not a long look. It did not need to be. Then he walked out of the tent. The sun was below the ridgeline now. The sky to the west had gone from bleached bone to the deep orange of a desert evening, the kind of color that looked like something a painter had invented and was actually just physics, particulates and angle, and the way light behaved when it had the whole Mojave to cross before it reached the eye. The shadows from the eastern ridgeline moved out across the desert floor in long, flat shapes. The dead ground fold in the northeast was already in shadow at its mouth, although it would hold its heat for hours yet. Stroud crossed the 400 meters between the command tent and the observation area at a walk that was almost a run. He had been a controlled man for a long time, and control was still with him but sitting lighter now. Underneath it was something he had not felt in years, something close to fury, not at Cullen, not at the heat or the terrain or the system. At the comfortable arrogance of men who had decided that a problem they created could be solved by destroying the man who had warned them about it. He passed the observation area and did not stop. He went over the low berm at the mouth of the dead ground fold and into the shadow, and the heat hit him the way it hit anyone who went in unprepared for it, a solid thing rather than a temperature, something you moved through rather than something that surrounded you. He stopped and listened. At the fold entrance, SFC Trot turned when Stroud arrived. Trot had his radio in hand, his position at the boundary precisely where Cullen had told him to stay, and on his face was the expression of a man who had been working the net hard for the last 30 minutes and was very glad to see the co. "He is in there," Trot said. "He has the soldier. Route is confirmed. He needs you to follow the path he marked." "How far in?" "He said 30 meters past the second depression. There are stone markers on the ground. Stay exactly on them." Stroud nodded. He went over the berm and into the fold. 30 meters ahead, slightly to the north of the fold's center line, he heard a voice. Cullen's voice. Low and even, the voice of a man giving instructions in a precise sequence, at exactly the pace required for the person listening to absorb each one before the next arrived. Stroud moved toward the voice. He found them where the fold curved back on itself and created the low rock shelf that Patch had been sheltering against. Cullen was standing 6 feet from the shelf, and Patch was standing next to him, on his feet, color still high in his face but eyes tracking and focused. Between the shelf and the nearest edge of the UXO field, Cullen had placed a series of small stones at 2-meter intervals, marking a path through the depression field the way a man marked a minefield in the old way, with whatever was at hand, when the old way was the only way that worked. Cullen looked at Stroud when the LTC appeared. He did not look surprised. He did not look relieved. He looked at Stroud the way he looked at terrain, carefully and without judgment, taking in information. Stroud said, "Tell me what you need." Cullen looked at him for 1 full second. Then he said, "Stay on the stones." He turned and began walking the path he had marked. Stroud stayed on the stones. The path through the UXO field was not straight. Nothing in this fold was straight. The terrain curved and folded in on itself, and the basalt shelf affected the compaction of the ground above it in ways only readable with the right context. Cullen had the right context. He had June's notations in the margin of the topographic map, and he had the knowledge that basalt shelf topography in this region ran at a consistent bearing of 22 degrees from magnetic north, which meant that if you held that bearing constant, you could walk a line through the field that kept you above the thickest part of the shelf, where the ordnance, if it had sunk to depth in the decades since placement, would be furthest below your boots. He walked that line. He placed his feet. He did not hurry. Stroud watched each placement and put his own feet in the same positions. Behind Stroud, Patch moved in the same pattern, 3 sets of boots on the same line through the dark ground, one after another, separated by exactly the distance Cullen had specified. The desert around the fold was going darker by degrees. The sky above still held the last of the day's light, a thin band of orange above the eastern ridgeline, but inside the fold the shadow was complete and thickening toward the full dark of a desert night. Cullen produced a small red lens flashlight from his breast pocket, the kind that preserved night vision while providing enough light to read a map. He used it only twice to check June's notations, confirming bearing and the estimated diameter of the second depression field lying between their current position and the eastern exit of the fold. The OPFOR element, 3 soldiers from the 11th ACR Black Horse who had been in the fold's reserve position since before the exercise started, had moved the moment Trot's radio traffic made the real-world nature of the situation clear. They were professionals. They understood the difference between a training scenario and an actual problem, and when the actual problem presented itself, they had consolidated their gear and repositioned to the south wall of the fold, and waited with the patience of men who were good at their jobs. Cullen passed within 8 meters of their position and nodded once. The OPFOR team leader, a staff sergeant named Wicks, nodded back. Some things did not require rank or authorization. Then they were past the second depression field. Then they were at the eastern exit of the fold. And then the scree field presented itself. Cullen saw it before they reached it, which was how it was supposed to work. The eastern exit narrowed between two rock faces, and the narrowing had created, over decades, a collection of loose aggregate on the slope below the southern face, the kind of accumulation that built up when freeze and thaw cycles worked on exposed rock and shed material downward. There was nothing in any database about this, current or historical. It was just physics and time. But the aggregate was real and the slope beneath it was real. And if you put a boot wrong on the leading edge of the scree, the whole section could give and take you down into a secondary depression that had not existed in 1967, when June was here with her notebooks and instruments. Cullen stopped. He studied the scree for 15 seconds in the beam of his red lens light. He studied the angle of repose, the composition of the aggregate, the way the larger fragments sat on top of the smaller ones, which told him where the surface was stable enough to hold weight and where it was not. He turned to Stroud. "Stay exactly where you are." Stroud stayed. Cullen took 3 steps to the left, off the line he had been holding, into what appeared to be more difficult terrain. He placed his right boot on a flat rock face that was part of the northern wall rather than the scree aggregate. He placed his left boot on a second flat rock face barely visible in the red light. He moved across the northern wall in a lateral traverse that took him past the scree field entirely, above it, using the rock face as a walkable surface rather than the aggregate below. He moved without hurrying. He placed his feet with the care of a man who had been doing this for 50 years and understood that speed was not what kept you safe in terrain like this. He reached the far side of the scree and turned back. "Come exactly where I went," he said. "Right boot on the flat face at 9 o'clock from your current position. Left boot will find the second face. Do not touch the aggregate." Stroud came exactly where he had gone. Patch came after Stroud. All 3 stood on the far side of the scree field in the last of the fold's shadow and looked out at the eastern approach to the training area, where the ground opened up into the broader desert, and the air moved again, and the temperature dropped 4 degrees in the space of 20 meters. The night was full dark. The stars were extraordinary. Cullen looked up at them for exactly the amount of time it took to take a bearing from Polaris and confirm his position relative to the forward operating base. Then he checked the topo map. Then he started walking. At the fold mouth, Trot had not been idle. From the moment he watched Stroud go into the fold, the SFC had been running the external situation with the precision and economy of a man who understood that 2 crises were happening simultaneously, and both required management. He worked the radio net, feeding updates to the command post. He managed the coordination with the company element that was standing down near the observation area, and he briefed the route that Cullen had walked him through before entering the fold. Cullen had been thorough at the fold entrance. He had shown Trot the approach bearing, the 2-kilometer circumnavigation route around the outside of the northeast terrain feature. He had described the key terrain checkpoints, the bearing corrections at each one. He had done it in 4 minutes from memory, without looking at the map. The man who wrote the doctrine had the doctrine in him. Trot had listened to every word and committed it to the same memory that had served him through 18 years of operations, and he had it now when he needed it. 15 soldiers, 1 route, no drones because the drones were not calibrated for the fold, and Trot had made the same calculation Cullen would have made about the value of information that showed you nothing versus the value of moving carefully on a path someone who knew this ground had already described in detail. Trot counted pace. He held bearing with his lensatic compass. He kept the formation tight and quiet and moving. At 11:47 in the evening, the first soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment reached the designated consolidation point on the eastern side of the dead ground feature. Cullen was already there. He was sitting on a flat rock at the edge of a chemical marker placed at the consolidation point earlier in the day, looking at the topographic map, and Drew Patch was sitting 6 feet away with an IV in his arm and a medic working on him, and the color coming back into his face at the rate that meant he was going to be fine. Stroud was standing at Cullen's 10 o'clock, also looking at the map, not saying anything, learning something by watching the man who was reading it. Trott's formation arrived in good order and consolidated without drama. Trott counted his soldiers. He counted them again. He gave Cullen a nod that contained several things, none of which needed to be said out loud. By 2 in the morning, the immediate situation was resolved. By 3, the medical status of all personnel was confirmed and documented. By 4:30, the first light of the desert pre-dawn was touching the eastern ridgeline tops in a gray that was not yet color, but was no longer dark. At 5:12 in the morning, Rafe Cullen and Bo Stroud walked out of the fold's eastern approach together, side by side, with Patch between them on a litter carried by 2 soldiers from 3rd Platoon. The rescue helicopter that B.G. Harless had authorized an hour earlier was waiting at the forward landing point, rotors at idle. Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything worth recording. The desert absorbed the arrival of 22 people at a consolidation point with the same indifference it absorbed everything else. The sun was coming, and the sun did not care what had happened in the dark. Cullen folded the topographic map and put it in his breast pocket. He sat down on a piece of equipment case at the edge of the landing point and sat without moving for 3 minutes, which was the first time he had been entirely still since 4 in the afternoon the previous day. The heat was already building in the east. By 7, it would be back to its full and indifferent weight, and the desert would look exactly as it had yesterday morning, and the morning before that, and every morning for the past 10,000 years. He was 71 years old. His knee ached. His right forearm ached. His back would register its opinion about the night when he stood up, and he would deal with that opinion when it arrived, the way he had been dealing with his body's opinions about things he asked of it for the past 5 decades. He was alive. All 22 of the people he was responsible for were alive. The map had worked. Brigadier General Myron Harless arrived at the consolidation point at 6:14 in the morning in a command vehicle that raised a low wake of dust from the main road. He stepped out with 2 aides and the expression of a general officer, managing several simultaneous problems and calculating which to address first. He looked at the litter where Patch was resting. He looked at the medical personnel and the assembled formation and the empty sky where the drones had been. He looked at Stroud. Then he looked at Cullen. There was something in that look that had no version in any look Cullen had received from Stroud the previous morning. This was the look of a man who knew exactly who Rafe Cullen was, and exactly what Rafe Cullen represented to him. A man who had made a decision 23 years ago in a room with a sealed document and a pen, and who was standing in a desert at 6 in the morning looking at the consequences of that decision, still standing, undefeated, in front of him. Harless said, "Mr. Cullen, you operated outside the parameters of your consulting agreement last night." Cullen said nothing. "That is a serious matter. The liability exposure to this installation alone is significant." Cullen said nothing. "I expect a full accounting will be required." A figure stepped between them. Colonel Ruth Camp had arrived in the vehicle behind Harless's, and she had covered the distance between the parking area and the general's position, with the unhurried purpose of someone who had been waiting a long time to be standing exactly where she was standing now. She was carrying a folder, the same folder she had placed on the briefing table in the command tent the previous evening. She held it out to Harless. "General," she said, "I have a federal warrant for the arrest of Blaine Dodd on charges related to fraudulent contract acquisition, deliberate concealment of material risk data in the Talon 9 terrain database, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government." She paused. "There is a second document in the folder. It is a letter of inquiry from the Inspector General's office addressed to Brigadier General Myron Harless, requesting his voluntary cooperation in the same investigation." She paused again, exactly as long as it needed to be. "The letter mentions the 1998 Fort Polk investigation finding, the original finding before it was modified, the sealed reprimand, and the name of the officer who authorized the modification." The desert was completely quiet. The sun was fully above the ridgeline now, and the light was flat and white and unsparing. It illuminated everything equally and excused nothing. Harless stood in it with the stillness of a man who had lived for a long time with the weight of something he had done, and who was arriving, finally, at the moment he had always known was somewhere ahead of him. He took the folder, he looked at the cover, he did not open it. He said, very quietly, "I would like to speak with my legal counsel." "That is your right," Camp said. "The IG's office will be in contact." Harless looked at Cullen one more time. The look lasted 2 seconds. Then he turned and walked back to his command vehicle and got in and closed the door, and the vehicle drove away in the same low wake of dust it had arrived in. Blaine Dodd was walked from the command tent to a waiting military police vehicle at 6:42 in the morning by 2 MPs who had arrived with Camp's convoy. He went without resistance. He had the quality of a man who had understood for the past several hours that the moves had run out, and who had spent those hours calculating what cooperation might purchase compared to what obstruction might cost. He did not look at Cullen as he was walked past the consolidation point. He looked at the ground. The Death Star System's clipboard was still on the table in the command tent. Nobody picked it up. The formal debrief happened at 800 hours in the main briefing tent, without Harless, without Dodd, and without the Talon 9 presentation display, which had been powered down and its data seized pursuant to Camp's warrant. The officer who chaired it was a colonel from the Division G3, a quiet and thorough woman named Evers who conducted the proceedings with the focused neutrality of someone who understood that what she was documenting was going to be read carefully by people at several levels of command, and that accuracy was more valuable than any other quality the record could have. Trot gave his account first, then the platoon leaders, then Patch from the litter in a voice that was steady and clear and did not dramatize anything. Each account described the same sequence of events from a different position, and the sequence, when assembled in order, was exactly the sequence Cullen had anticipated and described at 6 in the morning the previous day on an overturned ammunition crate with a cup of coffee. Cullen gave no formal account. He sat at the end of the table with his topographic map folded on the surface in front of him, and answered the questions Colonel Evers asked him with the brevity of a man who had given briefings for a long time, and understood that extra words did not add to the record, they diluted it. When the debrief concluded, the tent emptied in the way tents emptied after long and necessary proceedings, with the movement of people who needed air and distance, and the relief of being finished with something that had required a great deal of them. Stroud was the last officer out. He stopped in the entrance and turned back. He looked at Cullen. Cullen was still at the table. He was looking at the topographic map, not reading it, just looking at it the way you looked at something that contained more than you could fully account for. Stroud crossed the distance between them. He extended his hand. Cullen looked at the hand. He took it. The handshake lasted 2 seconds, the appropriate length between men who had not been friends yesterday and were not quite friends today, but had reached some understanding in the dark of a dead-ground fold that did not yet have a name. Then Stroud did something Cullen had not expected. He brought his right hand up to the brim of his patrol cap. He held the salute for 3 full seconds, 1 second longer than protocol required, which meant it was not protocol anymore but something else entirely. He said, "Sir." "One word." Cullen looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once. The nod was small and contained everything. Stroud lowered his hand and walked out of the tent. Cullen sat with the map for another minute. Then he heard footsteps and Colonel Camp came back through the tent flap with the quietness of someone who had been waiting for the tent to clear before entering. She sat down across from him. She put an envelope on the table between them. A standard Army administrative envelope, sealed, with his name typed on the front. Beneath his name, the return address was the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations and Plans, Department of the Army. He looked at it, he looked at her. "G3 sent it through my office," she said. "We have been in communication with them for some time about the broader matter. The timing was coordinated." She stopped. Then she said, "Open it, Mr. Cullen." He picked up the envelope and opened it with the careful and unhurried movement of a man who had learned to open things slowly rather than tearing them apart. The letter inside was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph stated that the Army was initiating the formal review and reinstatement of Field Manual Supplemental Doctrine 320, 526, Terrain Analysis and Dead Ground Navigation, originally authored by then Master Sergeant Rafe Cullen, 75th Ranger Regiment, in 1976, and subsequently updated through 1997. It stated that the review was expected to result in full reactivation of the supplemental doctrine and its integration into current training curricula. It stated that the Army requested the author's participation in revising the document for current operational context. The second paragraph was 4 sentences. The document will require a new foreword. The current foreword, which was removed from the record along with the doctrine itself, has been located and preserved. We believe the doctrine should also include a dedication page. That decision is yours. Cullen read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at the topographic map. The notations in the left margin were the same notations they had always been, precise and small and written in a hand that was not his own. Wind direction by season, soil composition at depth, the thermal behavior of the basalt shelf, the things that June had known because she had stood in this terrain with her instruments and her notebooks and her particular genius for understanding what the ground was made of and what it was doing and why. The things she had written down because she understood, without being told, that he would need them someday. He thought about the dedication page. He did not think about it for long. He folded the topographic map along its creases, the same creases it had always had, worn soft from years of use. He put it in his breast pocket, in the place it always went, where the corner of it rested against his chest when he walked. He picked up the letter and put it in the envelope, and put the envelope in his back pocket. He stood up from the table. His knee registered its opinion. His back registered its opinion. He acknowledged both and moved anyway, the way he had always moved, the way a man moved when he understood that the body's complaints were information rather than instructions. He walked out of the tent into the morning. The Mojave was already at full heat, the democratic heat that fell equally on everything and treated nothing as more important than anything else. The mountains to the east were sharp in the clear air. The desert floor stretched in every direction with the patience of something that had been here before everything else and would be here after everything else, and had no particular investment in the events of any single day. Trot was waiting outside the tent. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. He held one out without speaking. Cullen took it. They stood side by side and drank coffee and looked at the desert the way men looked at terrain they had come through in the dark and were now seeing for the first time in the light. After a while, Trot said, "What happens now?" Cullen looked at the northeast ridgeline, at the fold that was invisible from this angle, the dead ground that held its secret until you were standing inside it, the place that no screen had been able to see into, and no database had accounted for, and no drone had mapped in the 11 years and $2.3 billion that the system had spent becoming what it was. Now, Cullen said, somebody writes it down. He finished his coffee. He handed the cup back to Trot. He walked toward the vehicle waiting to take him back to the main installation, and he did not look back at the tent, and he did not look toward the parking area where the military police vehicle had been and was no longer. He walked the way he had walked for 50 years, with his eyes on the ground in front of him, and his weight balanced between his heels and the balls of his feet, reading the surface as he crossed it, measuring without thinking about measuring, understanding without deciding to understand. The topographic map was in his breast pocket. He could feel it there, the weight of it, the thickness of folded paper that contained 40 years of accumulation, his own pencil marks and her pencil marks, and the terrain of 100 days spent in difficult places trying to understand what the ground was telling him. It had told him everything he needed to know last night. It had told him the truth when every screen in the installation was showing something else. He put his hand over his breast pocket for a moment as he walked. Just a moment, just the pressure of a palm against paper against the thing it meant. Then he took his hand away and kept walking. Behind him, at the eastern mouth of the dead ground fold, the sun reached the lowest point of the terrain for the first time that day. The light went into the fold the way light went into places it had not reached in a long time, all at once, without hesitation, filling the dead ground from the bottom up. The basalt absorbed it. The sand held it. The depressions that no map had marked were exactly where they had always been, visible now in the morning light, exactly as deep and exactly as real and exactly as dangerous as the old man with the old map had said they were. Sergeant Drew Patch, sitting up on the litter with a saline drip in his arm and a second cup of water in his hand, watched the light reach the bottom of the fold from the consolidation point 400 meters away. He watched it for a long time. Then he reached into the cargo pocket of his uniform pants and pulled out the small notebook that every soldier in the battalion carried, and he opened it to a blank page. He did not yet know what he was going to write, but he held the pen ready.